Good therapy is about always go to the humanity first. Don't go looking for pathology or diagnosis or labels, go to the humanity.
That one size fit all doesn't really work, and looking at that person and looking at their lives, looking at the energy they have within themselves, that's really important. That's what really helped me.
We have to have therapy as therapists. I think that's a really important thing to say. I'm not sitting here as some guru. I mean, I've had my own...
I thought you were fixed.
No, never.
Oh, no way.
Don't be deluded.
This episode contains discussions of suicide, so please listen with care. You can find links to resources in the show notes. 12 million men say they have never spoken about their mental health, and that is 20% of the UK population. In this episode of Well Enough, I am joined by TV presenter and leading mental health campaigner Matt Johnson. Matt is a representative for Mind and for Movember. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
We're also joined by Owen O'Kane, Sunday Times best-selling author of Addicted to Anxiety. He's also the therapist to stars like Lewis Capaldi. Thank you so much for joining us, Owen.
Thank you for having me.
I wonder if both of you could give maybe a clearer definition of what some of the symptoms of depression and anxiety are, because someone might be experiencing them and maybe might not even be able to recognise those.
Well, I can speak from my experience. What I was going through in between 2007 and 2009 would be now classed as depression, and quite serious depression. There was no feeling of joy or in any situation. I wasn't excited about anything. The feelings that I had were very numb and dumbed down. I wasn't able to connect with anyone. I couldn't really have eye contact. I was shying away from social situations, but only if I had alcohol I could engage in those activities, and I felt a lot of that time very lonely and isolated. So from my perspective, that period of depression that I was going through, the symptoms were quite obvious, and I was like I said, self-diagnosing for a lot of the time. I had no idea what was going on. It was a lot different to what it is now. I had no idea. There was no real podcast or anything to go to about what I was going through. But yeah, my symptoms were pretty numbed down across the board.
I think there are often symptoms that we miss with depression, so you never see in a tick box loneliness. When I worked in the NHS, you never see that as a symptom, and yet it's probably one of the key symptoms of depression, where people feel very, very lonely and disconnected in some way, but we don't kind of really measure that as problematic. And a lot of people as well, particularly men, will try to continue functioning as normal. So it's really difficult to sometimes differentiate, because they're going to work, they're out socialising, they're having a beer, they're going to football, whatever they might be doing. So it's hard to see within all of that, well, you seem to be doing okay, what's going on. And then normally when you start to break it down with people, you discover there is a day-to-day stuff, there's patterns of thought that can be problematic in terms of how they're thinking, often very negative, critical thought processes that go on. A real lack of interest, just that feeling of I genuinely can't be arsed doing anything. And it's not it's not even demotivation. It goes beyond that. It's just like, actually, no, I don't want to. I can't. The thought of like going to the shop for some milk might feel completely overwhelming. And I think these symptoms can vary with people, and I guess my rule of thumb is that, if there's been a period where the bad days start to outnumber the good days, well, then that's normally a really good time to go for help or support, or at least speak to someone. Because this is the tragedy, really. There's so many things, and I'm sure Matt would agree. There's just so many treatments and so many small things that we can do that can be enormously helpful. But it's just that the beginning of that conversation where it feels like everything's falling apart, or it feels like everything's dark. If somebody at that stage can realise, actually, this first initial step could be one of the most powerful that you can take, there's real freedom in that. So, like if we had 20 people here today saying, talk me through your depression, they would all give us a different story and varying symptoms.
I think what was difficult for me was trying to push a square peg through a round hole with all those symptoms: the lack of joy, the isolation, the loneliness, the self-diagnosis, the alcoholism, all those things that I was dealing with. The lack of sleep, actually. I was so tired and everything was overwhelming. Like getting out of bed was a struggle. Having to go to work and having to do the normal day-to-day things and trying to socialize was the point where I felt like I couldn't continue anymore, because that was the most difficult part. Was I was unaware of what I was going through. I thought my family was cursed or something. I just didn't know what was happening to me. But the faking it till I made it, that turning up every day and pretending, that was the killer for me. That was the really difficult part for me, was that finding the energy to pretend and put on another mask for whoever I was working for at that time. And that was the real problem for me. It was that inauthenticity of life.
Yeah. If I'm working with somebody who's struggling with depression, rather than try and get too over involved in the chemical stuff and the symptoms, I often think if you can think of this as a part of you, a part of you that's in difficulty, and how you want to relate to that part of you and how you want to work with it and what that part might need. That can be revolutionary for most people, and particularly if people have kids or someone in their family that they're really close to, and you think, okay, if you were watching them go through a really awful time, and they were finding it hard to get through the day, what would you want to do for them? And most people will immediately say, I'll sit down with them and I'll comfort them and I'll look after them and I'll tell them there's no pressure. So in therapy, very often what you're trying to do is saying, what would it be like for you to work with this part of you? So rather than see it as a negative or a bad thing or a terrible thing, even though the symptoms are uncomfortable, what would it be like to this is going to sound really cliched, but what would it be like to take this part of you by the hand and say, it's all right, I'm going to look after you? And that permission and that freedom, I see this in practice all the time, that can be a great starting point, because there's no judgment, there's no shame. It's like, no, this is a part of you that's having a hard time. We're going to start looking after the part.
That's that's what was really interesting about mine, is that compartmentalization of the two things. With diagnosis, I could see that it was depression, and it kind of gives it reasoning. It allows you to see it for what it is. It's whether you want to call it an inner child thing or whatever. It helped me kind of see myself as two different beings, whereas the lack of awareness and the lack of understanding made me want to kill that part of myself. That's what it was. My suicide attempt in 2009 was, now I know in hindsight, me trying to just kill that part of me off. That was overtaking everything. But the love and compassion that I have when you do try and understand that part of yourself is frightened and scared and trying to keep you safe and all those different things, has really helped me then take care of that part of myself. So then I can it's quite like a light going on moment when I did have that difference of opinion, and then I could say, like, what do I need? What is that part of me trying to say? What is it saying? And it definitely was saying, please don't pretend anymore and pretend to be this person. If you don't want to be in that social situation, maybe avoid it for a little bit. And as soon as I switched that, immediately I didn't feel that negative energy towards myself as much. It really, that compassion for that part of me helped me exponentially.
I hope you're finding Matt and Owen's advice useful and enjoying this episode. Here at Well Enough, we want to keep conversations like this one going, and they're crucial for advancing conversations around mental health and other topics around wellbeing in the UK. But we can only do this with your support, so please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode. Thank you. Owen, could you describe for us what the landscape looks like in the UK for men's mental health at the moment?
It's pretty grim, if I'm being honest. I think there are two things. This is not new information, but there is just a lack of treatment. I worked in the NHS as a clinical lead for mental health, and I know people are doing their best. So it's not a criticism of the NHS or the people who work within it, because they are working at capacity, doing their very, very best. But there are just a lot of people out there who don't have access to help. And I think part of the challenge is that people believe that, as Matt was saying earlier, they're about not boxing people off. It's rare to meet someone who's just depressed, because often they might have some depression, but they also might be quite anxious alongside that, or they might have strong anxiety, but they might have secondary low mood, or they might have background trauma that's never been dealt with. So, or there might be addiction in the background,
ADHD, the symptoms of ADHD,
the kind of neurodiversity and
stuff.
All of these things, and of course, we know about these conversations are very open, but I think sometimes we believe that people can be fit into a box. In mental health, they talk about primary mental health, which is just like people come with a disorder and they can be treated in 6 weeks, which is not going to happen. And then you get the other side of the scale, which is secondary mental health, where people might have more acute difficulties. But there's nothing for people who are in the middle, and in my experience, that's most of the population who are struggling. There is no kind of middle ground catchment. So I think that's a challenge and it's a difficulty. And I also think as well, we live in a culture where we have more information. We are talking more. We have access to language. So at one level, that's an incredibly good thing because it's just kind of opened up the conversation. But what it's also done is it's highlighted the deficit and the gap and the need. And we've kind of also moved into this very pathological diagnostic culture, which I think is beginning to become problematic. So it's a really mixed bag, but I think if I go back again to the simplicity just of some of what Matt was saying there, in my own, we have to have therapy as therapists. I think that's a really important thing to say. I'm not sitting here as some guru. I mean, I've had my own...
I thought you were fixed.
No, never.
Oh, no way.
Don't be deluded.
But you can't just soak up everyone else's feelings, can you? There has to be an outlet for that.
I mean, even outside of that, I think some of the best therapists I know have worked through a lot of their own story or their own stuff because it makes them particularly good at their job. And I remember even in my own therapy years ago having this moment where there was a realization that there are, we all walk around with three parts as adults. We've got our adult self, we function in the world and we do our jobs and everything's good. And then for most of us then we've also got this teenager inside us. And some of the stuff there may not have been resolved. And that's the part of us that might be a bit grumpy or a bit irritated or angry or
Cynical.
acting out, cynical, a little bit kind of defensive or reactive. And then beyond that, then you've got a child part. And often, I think a lot of us crash land into adulthood. And this is not about blaming families or cultures or religions, but a lot of our needs are not met. So we crash land into adulthood, and often the needs of the child or the teenager have been neglected, and the adult then just plows ahead without realising, okay, there's all of this stuff going in here. And I think most of it, for anyone who's struggling really, what they've managed to do is to get away. They've got out of their childhood, they've got through their teenage years, and they've got into adulthood, and they've survived. And most of their life has been about survival. But, I remember in my own therapy once, my therapist pointed out to me, he said, God, you've done a very good job with the survival stuff. So for me, it would have been more about anxiety because I grew up in Belfast and Irish and Catholic and all of that stuff, and sexuality and coming out. So there was a whole mixed bag of threat. And I remember my therapist said to me, God, you've done a really good job, but you got away. You got out and you learned how to survive and you learned how to function very well. And he said, but have you ever thought that you've never really gone back to rescue the little fella who was kind of left in the burning building? And I thought it was a brilliant analogy because he was describing that we often, if you think of that analogy of a house on fire, we get away and we get out and we stay in survival mode. But very few people go back to think, God, there's the emotional needs of this little person who was left behind. And I think very often that's what the work's about. When you're working with somebody who's going through a tough time, so when we're talking about meeting these parts, I mean, very often what you are doing is you're going back and you're meeting the part of you that's thinking, this didn't happen, and maybe you weren't looked after in the right way, and maybe you didn't, those needs didn't get met. So the adult in you then goes back and starts to do that work, and then people then do start to feel a lot better. But primarily these conversations are about going back to rescue yourself. And I think that's such an important conversation that, nobody is coming to, there's help and support out there and there's brilliant organisations, so you're not on your own, but ultimately you've got to do the work.
I think that's really integral with men as well. I think what men often want, and I speak from my personal experience and my male friends, it's transactional. What am I going to get out of this therapy? Am I going to be bigger, better, stronger? What's going to happen? And it's far more nuanced than that in this world. So I think there's so many reasons why men struggle to kind of get to that therapy. And of course, the services aren't as great without finances to get to that. And when you're doing all of this work and overhearing people talk about inner child work, it's like, what's going on? I need something. I need to feel better immediately. Whereas tools like the gym, you do get an immediate response. Your endorphins, you get bigger, you get healthier, and even alcohol, you get an immediate fix. All those types of things. And I think men as well in that arena, it's a long process therapy, and you have to do a lot of work yourself. And nobody's just going to wave a magic wand and fix you like that pint of wine does, and I think that's what's really interesting about it. It feels very transactional. I found it very difficult at the beginning to talk about my inner child. I just didn't understand that, I wanted it to be fixed straight away. And I think that's something that we're working with men. That's an uphill struggle too. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What was the inner child work that you did? What do you do to nourish your inner
I mean,
you?
it's interesting. I mean, it's funny you're talking about this inner child stuff, because that language sometimes, even me, and I'm a therapist, I do this stuff. That language makes me kind of get a bit, oh, God,
A bit
I
alarming
hate
for
that.
big, strong
There's
men,
sort of
can't
that,
it?
yeah. It's sort of like it gets a bit. I notice my own sort of internalized. I don't even know if it's internalized homophobia, but there's part of me thinking, oh, this is a bit soft. That inner child stuff, I kind of react to it a bit. I mean, it's interesting for me because I think I spent a lot of time doing, I think what a lot of blokes do is I spent a lot of time thinking, right, I'm gonna go to the gym, I'm gonna start running, I'm gonna do all these things. I learned how to meditate. So I think I guess in my 20s and my 30s I became kind of very functional well-being. And then it took me a long time to realize, and I think we see a lot of this in social media, particularly with men's health. It's all about, getting bigger, getting stronger. Sort of alpha culture. It's like it's building strength, building resilience. And don't get me wrong, all of these things are really important. But I think the point that we miss, and I see it every day of the week in social media, like we see all sorts of gurus giving tips and advice on what to do. And it's often about, okay, this is hard to not feel. This is hard to get away. This is hard to run. This is hard to avoid. And of course, in psychology, we know that's the very thing that just keeps a problem. It keeps it going. If all of the techniques are about, okay, if you do this here, then you're not going to feel sad. If you do this, you're not going to feel anxious. If you do this, then you're going to feel better. That's not what it's about. Life is not about feeling good all the time and feeling better and feeling top of the world. That's not the reality of the human condition. The kind of fluctuations and the ups and downs are part of that's what it is to be human. And often these, more difficult emotions that come up, they're actually there for a reason. They're not bad, they're not negative. Actually, they can be a really important part of getting you back to your point of balance or equilibrium or helping you regulate. So you're kind of working with both the whole time. And I guess we're in this culture at the minute, particularly in social media, where it seems to be about getting better, getting fixed quickly. But then my argument in all of this here is that, well, if it comes at the cost of abandoning yourself, which is like, okay, I won't allow myself to feel sad, I won't allow myself to struggle, I won't allow myself to get it wrong or fail or screw up, well then that becomes a self-abandonment as such, and that's never going to be a healthy thing. So I think the conversations get confused and lost.
This kind of self-optimization culture is quite tied up with what we call toxic masculinity, isn't it? And I mean, that phrase, there are pros and cons, I think, to using that phrase. It's also become one of these stereotypes that we throw around quite a lot. But I do worry about boys at school and how they're kind of taking on this self-optimization stuff, especially through social media. And I wonder what both of your thoughts are on that, because you've got healthy expressions of masculinity and the right language to talk about feelings and to not feel like you have to burn down the version of you that's sad or angry. And then you've got quite a different approach, which is what a lot of these optimization guys are talking about.
It's a fascinating conversation because for me, the whole kind of masculinity thing has always been a struggle. And I guess, as a gay kid growing up and coming out and all of that sort of stuff, there's always an inner battleground anyway about, God, what is it to be? I mean, certainly in my early days, it was about trying to be masculine so that I wouldn't be found out. So there's a lot of effort went in to try and, cover up so that there wouldn't be an exposure or somebody would find out about this here. And then, of course, you get older and wiser and you realize, well, all of this is about accepting self, really. And I guess one of the advantages, I mean, I used to, God, in my early 20s, I was like, oh God, why am I gay? My brothers are all straight, getting married, having kids. And I really felt it was like a negative. And I think, why? God, I just wish I could be, inverted commas, normal like everyone else. And that was a genuine, because it felt like it was too big a struggle and it was a big kind of hill to climb. Whereas the older I've got, I've realized actually there was so many advantages in all of that there, because it kind of really made me look at the values of, because a lot of the focus on masculinity is about the physicality, the persona, how you look, what are the values of a real man. Now, I know that sounds a bit stereotypical, but actually the reality is that still goes on a lot. And I think as a gay man having to navigate through all of that there, you just know that you can't buy into it. It's just not going to cut through. So you're almost forced to go the other way and kind of get to know all of these other parts of yourself and get comfortable with it. And then realize actually these values are just as important in terms of masculinity as all of these other things, but of course they don't get the exposure. And I guess if I'm working with groups of men, or I'm working with men of any description, I mean, it's interesting. I did a gig about 2 years ago for the motor industry, and it was 500 blokes. And they contacted me. It was odd that they chose me to come and do the gig, but part of the briefing was, this is 500 guys. They haven't done a mental health talk before. We think your tone might land very well with them, but you just might be mindful of maybe not revealing too much about your personal life. So I knew what they meant. They were very polite about it. I've had this before with religious organisations and stuff. I did a talk for 300 bishops, which was hilarious. I mean, again, why did they invite me? And that was, again, a tentative. They didn't say don't, but it was a tentative tiptoe. And so I'm always in these situations where it's kind of be aware that the audience... And interestingly, with these guys, I went in and I was quite nervous about doing the talk, because they'd sort of built it up that it was going to be a really difficult gig, and that they might be a little bit hostile and non-responsive and not receptive to it. And of all of the speaking gigs I've done in my career, they were probably the most hungry for content in all of my speaking gigs, and they were really open. And the questions were sensible and stuff. And I deliberately went in and I thought, in for a penny, in for a pound. I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to dress anything up. It was just a very ordinary, talked about my own life, talked about my work and some of these principles that we're talking about today. And they were 100% up for it.
Yeah.
And I kind of remember it really made me think about, we assume that guys are not open to these conversations, or they don't care, or they're not interested. But I think that's a fallacy.
100% agree with you. The work I do with Movember constantly, I do a lot of work up north with builders and building companies. Every single one is my favourite audience that I do. Everybody's so open and open to have conversations, and they love the authenticity of it. I think that's what it is. I think if you're open and honest about who you are, I think men in general really respond to that. Like when we see a footballer cry for whatever reason, or if we see somebody win at the championships and they show true emotion, men love that. They like that authenticity. I think society in a way doesn't allow any sort of form of emotion outside of maybe the sporting arena or when your first son is born or something. But from my experience, men are good. Like when you especially like the work I do with Movember, the influx of men now that are ready to have these conversations and to talk about it is astounding. It's just the issue from my perspective is that teenage group of young men. That's the problematic part.
Stephen Graham created that excellent show, Adolescence, and it really shone a light on just how susceptible young people can be and how far it can take them when they're experiencing a bombardment of messaging that is actually turning them into quite a radicalised young person when they themselves might not realise that that's happening to them. How worried are you both about the future of men's mental health if that's the kind of thing that young boys are experiencing?
It's a big question, and I think it's not just a question for men. And I think often the conversation goes about, how do men respond? How are young boys behaving? We also have to think it's a bigger conversation, because it's also about expectations of men. And the conversations about how we, how women see men and what they want them to be. And some of these traditional beliefs that men need to be strong and they have to be ripped. And, this is, now I know I'm being very, very general here, but I think there are some expectations around what a man should be. And I think we need to start having conversations broadly. I mean, it's similar with how men sometimes treat women. That's another conversation that we need to keep going back to, because sometimes, there are real problems in that area. But I think instead of thinking about men in isolation, I think we just need to start having broader conversations around, this is not just about men, but how do we create a culture in a society where actually there is a freedom, that this is all okay, and that these expectations to be whatever it is, to be a real man. I mean, even at a physical thing, I know a guy who's a physio, and he was telling me that he's seeing a lot of younger men who are struggling with like back issues and stuff. And I said, that's unusual. What do you think that's about? And he said, very often they're lifting weights and stuff
Yeah, lifting too
that
heavy in the gym.
they're not ready for. They're
Yeah,
like
too
literally
young.
physically, their bodies are not ready. They're not developed enough to be lifting the weights that they're lifting.
It's quite
Well,
worrying, I
steroids
think.
is a huge problem
Yeah.
for kids around that young age. It's a real issue, and you are absolutely right. And it just feels like because the expectation of what a man is so limited. You know, the breadwinner or big and strong, and that's it really. There's no conversation about how many different types of men there can be in this world. What type of man are you? Let's have a conversation about who you are as an individual. What level of the spectrum are you on femininity and everything? That doesn't seem to be allowed, and we can see the ramifications of that manifesting with men being the worst they've ever have been in humanity towards women, to themselves and to other men. And the stats there show horrific numbers, and it could start with the conversation of what actually is it to be not just a man, to be you as a human being in this world, and what expectations other people have. So for example, if there are, like you were saying brilliantly, like women have an expectation of what a man is in their world, and that's fine, that's okay. If that's your type, that's totally fine. Not every man should be able to fit into that category of person. I think it's a type thing. The conversation about individuality and individuals is super important. What type of man am I? Not the one I should be, because the idea of what a man should be is wrecking this planet as we speak.
I agree with you. I have a background as a sex and relationships journalist and an intimacy coach and a sex educator. And consistently, I saw this wedge between young people and the way they talk about each other's bodies, about dating, about what's acceptable. And you're totally right with what you said, Owen, in that it's a conversation we all have to be having, men and women.
I think so. And I think as well as like we sometimes work with the assumption that, women expect men to be X, Y, and Z. But I think too, there's a generalization in there, because often I think that can be cliched, where it might be, maybe not all women do expect this, and maybe women would prefer if there was more openness and vulnerability and sensitivity and stuff, because I mean, these are kind of like tabloid beliefs that, this is what women want and this is how you need to be. But it's a top line. So I think for these conversations to kind of emerge and grow, I don't think they should be done in isolation. I think they should include like all communities, however someone identifies, male, female, they, non-binary. It doesn't matter to me. I think it has to be a much more inclusive conversation, because there are many different types of men, there are many different types of people, there are many different types of women, and we know that fluidity, even in and around sexuality, it exists. It's there. That is the human condition again. Whereas all of this boxing that goes on
Totally. Yeah.
around,
It's very limiting.
It's like, I grew up in a really working class part of Belfast. And it was just like, there was a very clear notion of what it was to be a man there, and it was probably heightened even more because all of the violence that was going on. And that's interesting when I look back on then and think of the parameters of who I was. I was like this little kid learning to play piano, and a little kind of Billy Elliot sort of different description, but just running around kind of like living in this parallel universe where everything I didn't see life through that lens. But I was living in this culture where it was just like, okay, this is what you need to be, and this is how it has to be. And suddenly then you move away from that. And I remember when I first came to London and lived in London, suddenly just became aware of the different variety of people and choices and how people were. I remember being genuinely gobsmacked that these worlds exist. Now, this has gone back a long time. Things have moved on a lot. But yeah, this conversation, like even as we talk about it, you start thinking about the importance of this just has to become much more inclusive. And
And then now we have the beauty of social media, where you can see so many different types of people and so many ways of living and walks of life. And I'm not sure if people are ready for it. Anything new is quite scary. And I find that quite interesting about how we navigate our even people my age, how we navigate seeing something new every single day.
That's one thing we haven't mentioned. Beneath all of this, there's one key ingredient, and that's about fear. Some people are scared. I guarantee, like, if we were to sit down with a group of young guys now and talk to them and explore with them what's happening, right across the board, we would find a very anxious, fearful group of people. You know,
It's about being different as well, though, isn't it? I think you've both touched on that, the idea that you don't want to be perceived as different, vulnerable, weak, because you stand out, and standing out to the brain equals scary. And I wonder whether speaking about your emotions being perceived as weak is something that maybe will always follow us around. You know, it certainly might not even just be the case for men, it might be the case for everybody, that standing up and saying, I feel this, might be quite frightening because you are feeling vulnerable in that moment.
I had a young guy come to therapy last year, and he wasn't joking when he came in. So his parents had recommended that he see me, and he reluctantly came. They literally brought him to the office and dropped him off, and he came in and sat down. He was a really nice kid, actually, but he came in and sat down. He said, right, let's be clear, I'm here because they want me to be. He said, I don't really want any of the bullshit stuff. He said, I do feel a bit low and I'd like to feel a bit more motivated, so just help me out there. And I said, okay, well, that's a good starting point. And then he said, just one thing. And he said, there's one area that I won't go to. And I said, okay, what is it? He said, I don't want to do any of the feeling stuff. And I said,
welcome to therapy.
Well, all of it.
Therapy. I said, you know what that would be like? I said, that would be like going into a dentist and saying, I'm willing to sit in the chair, but I'm not going to open my mouth.
Don't touch my teeth.
Yeah.
I said, ain't going to happen. And he laughed, but it was a really serious request about, you know, I'm not going to do the feeling stuff. I don't want to go there. Whereas, of course, as a therapist, you're like, that's exactly where we're going.
Yeah, immediately.
And we're, you know, we're unapologetically going there, because that is the way through for most people, is going there and seeing what the feelings are trying to show. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? You know, if we all learned that these feelings are actually really useful, they come up, they're trying to communicate, they're trying,
Keep you safe.
it's a navigation system.
Yeah.
You know, they're just trying to communicate with you, and you get to know them and you work with them, and actually they'll often lead you in the right direction.
I want to try and make this as practical as possible as well, because we've just spoken about how hard it can be and how tough it can be to actually, once you found a therapist, do the work. I wonder what you think is the biggest change, or the best strategy that could close the gap between people experiencing anxiety, depression, loneliness, and actually speaking to someone and gathering the tools to make a difference to that.
Trying to get people to therapy is very tough, especially when it comes to men, and getting them to actually admit that that's the case, and then actually sticking with it and finding a good therapist. And that's a really long process. I just think it would be a really good idea for everyone to know the basics of, say, mental health first aid, to be able to spot signs, to be able to hold space, not to try and fix somebody, and to help them find the right type of therapy for them in that meantime. I think that's the grey area in the world at the moment. It feels like there's a lack of awareness with actual practical tools to what to do. Everywhere I go, I always get asked, like, what do I do if my son is struggling? And that's usually the case. So training people, or giving people that expertise to hold that space and to safely and send somebody Owen's direction. I think that, you know, I think that would be super important. And as well, like, we talk about influences from the dark side, and we there's so many good influences on the better side of masculinity, femininity, and just mental health and wellness in general. Highlighting these people are so important. There's really good people out there. There's good men out there, you know, as well as there's so many bad ones. But there's really good male role models out there. Nobody's perfect, and assigning that is really important. But just trying to get people to feel safe to talk about their issues, and know that whatever path they go down with therapy, that it's good to do that. It's a positive thing. Vulnerability is a positive thing, and asking for help is a really wonderful thing. If you want to know the transactional thing that I could offer a man right now out there, is that yes, you will feel better. You will get to your issues, and you will learn about yourself. It takes a little bit longer than maybe what you think than a gym session, but the on the other side of therapy, the grass is definitely greener.
Yeah, no, it's a great way of putting it, actually. And I think that a kind of core message that doesn't get translated enough is the fact that, you know, there's a lot of effort. We know things are difficult at the moment. I mean, we live in a difficult world, and it's, you know, you are right. You put on the telly in the morning, and it's like, it's difficult stuff to ingest. But I think, you know, in the absence of not being able to immediately change some of the challenges that go on in the world, I mean, the core conversation for me is always about coming back to the fact that, you know, the stuff that you can change and work on is your inner platform. And that does become like a stabilization. If you've got a steady inner platform, whatever that looks like, it just means that whatever life throws at you, or whatever comes your direction, whatever the uncertainty, the unpredictability is, if you're steady in your own skin, then it's going to be much more manageable. And by that I mean that, you know, you don't become the contents of the mind. You know, you get okay with these emotions that come and go and pass through. You know, you literally get out of your own way sometimes and let stuff just come and go naturally. And then you kind of take responsibility and hold responsibility for, okay, well, how are you living your life? You know, what does your day look like? What sort of foods are you putting into your body? You know, when are you getting exercise in? Who are the people in your life? What decisions are you making? Are you doing stuff in your life that puts fire in your belly? You know, are you doing stuff that matters? Because I think that's a really important part of the conversation, because it's very easy, particularly if we're struggling, to drift and just kind of go through the motions, and life can then just kind of start to feel like we're on a bit of a hamster wheel, whereas it's like, actually, you know, if you can hold ownership and take responsibility for these things, then, you know, the basic stuff like the food, the diet, the lifestyle, the choices, the people in your life, they can be incredibly important and they can really like improve your life significantly. But it does ultimately come back to the, okay, how am I talking to myself? How am I treating myself? How am I looking after myself? Because, you know, you get on board with that and you get, you know, like we're here for a short period of time, but the one thing that we're stuck with for the entirety of our life is ourselves. You know, we are like, that is that is the harsh reality. Whatever's going on in your internal world, it's with you until the day you die. So it's a pretty good idea to get comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And get to know all of that and get okay with it all. You know, it took me a long time to work that out. You know, that there was a real perfectionist in me when I was younger. You know, understandably so, thinking I had to have it all worked out and I had to be a good person and I had to be the best at what I'm doing. And there's a real freedom. One of the things I'm enjoying about getting older is a real freedom of thinking, sometimes I can fuck it up and get it wrong. Sometimes I can fail. Sometimes I can make a mistake. And you know, and there's no problem with that. It's like, this is all part of being a human being and getting to know all of these parts. I often say that when we talk about these parts, you know, like you might have a part that's sad, you might have a part that's anxious or fearful or self-doubting, and then we have all these other parts that are strong and capable and in love and all of that stuff. And I describe it like a dinner party, you know. And most people, if they're having a dinner, if I'm doing talks or whatever, or workshops for people, I talk about the parts that we all have. And I'd say, you know, what parts of yourself would you invite to the dinner party? And of course, like everybody would be inviting, well, the part of me that's strong and funny and charismatic and the achiever and me and stuff. So they would get a seat at the table. And I say, okay, what about all these other parts? What about the part of you that's a bit sad or a bit lonely or isolated? And people are just like, oh, not really, don't really fancy bringing that part of me to the dinner table. And say, well, where do they go? So they get left outside and they get abandoned. Whereas, you know, over the years, what I've discovered, the people who are happiest and the people who get the most from life, I think, are the people who are, and just they invite everyone in. So every part, so they're okay with it. You know, they're okay with all of it. And I think, you know, this is the conversation we're having today is about that. Actually, it's about just getting comfortable with all of these parts of self. They're not right or wrong or good or bad. They're just part of who we are. The protector parts are normally there to keep an eye on the kind of more deep, vulnerable, you know, the parts of us that don't feel lovable or unsafe or powerless. So they all serve a function. And if you then get to know them and stuff, it can be really quite interesting.
You also touched on something that I thought was really interesting, which was these kind of coping strategies in life. You know, how are you speaking to yourself? What are you doing with your body? How much sleep are you getting? And I think one of the big barriers to entry for therapy is obviously cost. For a lot of people, they're not able to access that resource, either because there's a big waiting list or because it's too expensive. So I wonder whether you have any practical advice for lifestyle changes or strategies that people might be able to do on the spot that could help them if therapy isn't immediately available to them.
That was a big thing for me. I didn't have therapy for a while, and now I have been for over 10 years. It's been brilliant, but intermittent. So in between my periods of therapy and beforehand, the tools that I picked up were really amazing. When I first talked about my suicide attempt on This Morning in 2013, I was blown away by how many kind people were out in the world, and they were all offering me advice. Some of the best advice that I had was journaling. Yeah, so I journal as often as I can. It's not, I do tend to grab it when I'm not feeling great, but it does help. Having conversations. So I've got numerous friends in my friendship group, and I feel myself bubbling away sometimes. I will definitely just trauma dump on them, or I'll just, have a conversation with them about it. But for me, like the basic things, like, looking at what I'm doing with my health. Am I walking enough? And a walk in nature always helps. And it's so boring and so predictably right. But getting those steps in is really important. Going to the gym maybe, and just cleaning up my diet, because sometimes, I still, as we were saying, I'm way off perfect, and there's messy parts to me all times, and that upset inner child pops up that's desperate for me to go and play somewhere. And I'm very lucky that I'm in check with all of that. But it's those really predictable things, like drinking lots of water and journaling if you can, and having a human connection with people. And when I do 3 or 4, maybe 5 of those things on a regular basis over a few days, I have a bit more of a spring in my step, And I know therapy is really difficult to get hold of, or very expensive, but controlling what I can is incredibly important to me.
I think you're so right. It always baffles me how good I feel after a long walk. Things become a lot clearer. Everything, the clouds part.
Yeah, and therapy is therapy, and the gym is a tool, but it does help. It does help boost endorphins scientifically. It's a wonderful thing. Sunlight is great. Dogs are great. Yeah. Petting a dog. I mean, everybody, I prescribe you all pugs. I mean, get one. They're the best things in the world. But all of these small things add up to really big things. Every time you do choose one of those things, you're choosing yourself, knowing who you are, what you want, which is a really nice little concoction.
Yeah. And it's every single thing you've described there brilliantly is, there's research around all of this here, because you say, it's kind of almost like, oh, go for a walk in nature, and you can see almost the eye rolling. It's like, oh God, here we go again. But actually the research is like, the neuroscientists look at this stuff and they think, actually, that 15-minute walk in nature can genuinely, it can reduce your blood pressure, it can reduce your cortisol levels. It can help, with kind of the feel-good chemicals that we know enhance our mood. So every single thing you've mentioned comes with research, clinical-based evidence to say, actually, in between therapy, which therapy is 1 hour a week, but good therapy is actually, now this is a minuscule part of it. The rest of it is what goes on in your life. So in the absence of therapy, people can be doing all of these things. I mean, the only thing I would add is, I would say, is from a more sort of therapeutic point of view, where we can operate from a thing called a negative default mode, which most people have. And I think it's really useful to get to know what your negative default mode is, so that if a situation comes up, or there's something going on in your life where you've had a reaction, or there's something big happening, it's a really useful thing to be able to stand back and think, okay, where am I operating from at the minute? Am I operating from my negative default mode? And even that question in itself can be really powerful, because you can then say, okay, I sort of know where this goes. This is a rabbit hole, and when I go down this rabbit hole, it kind of has a very predictable conclusion. So you immediately get the choice of, okay, well, where am I operating from? If I'm in this negative default mode, okay, is there a possibility that I can transition and move across and operate from a different level? Or you can think of it in a way, okay, well, sometimes if I'm working with younger people, put glasses on, a pair of sunglasses or something, and say, look, we have choices in terms of how we see the world and how we see life. And sometimes we wear the same predictable glasses, and that can be quite negative and critical and judgmental and quite dark. Whereas actually, when we know that, we can think, actually, I'm a bit bored and I'm a bit exhausted with this. I wonder, is there another way of looking at this? I wonder, can I be a bit more open? Can I be a bit more curious? Can I be a bit more interested? And then immediately you get this, you get an immediate shift in, okay, well, I'm empowered here. I'm not just kind of going with what I normally do. So I think on top of a lot of things you've mentioned as well, I think just it's a really important question to ask every single day, okay, who's in charge here? Who's operating here today? And, look, none of us, we do not wake up every day feeling completely motivated and ready, and
Springing out of
we're
bed
all
going, "I'm
battling. Yeah,
driving."
of course. We
Total
don't like,
opposite.
yeah, you get days when you think, all right, there's a bit of work to be done and there's a few tweaks and adjustments, but it's incredible how easy you can transition across and think, okay, well, that doesn't need to be the case today. And there are possibilities out there. And I think as well, we haven't talked about hope. And I don't mean like hope in a airy, fairy dust way, because I don't think that's ever useful. But I spent 10 years working with people who were terminally ill. I was a palliative care specialist before training as a therapist. So I would see people often in dire situations where they had a life-limiting condition, very often young people who weren't going to live very long. So I spent 10 years of my career working with people who were nearing the end of their life. And someone asked me recently, what did I learn most in those 10 years? And actually what really struck me was that how important hope was, even in the most dire of circumstances, and actually how hope for these people often became about living. And it wasn't the focus on dying, it was about making the best of life. And that didn't mean that there was going to be a happy ever after or an incredible outcome, or that there was going to be some miracle, but it did mean that they were able to see beyond the adversity and the challenges and hold on to the fact that, there are things today that are good, and there are things that I can enjoy today, and there are things that I want to look forward to. And I think that's such an important conversation, that it's that kind of holding on to that belief that whatever the difficulty or the adversity is, that there are possibilities beyond this. And that if you're willing to allow this to be whatever it is, or whatever the difficulty is, trusting that you will be okay and there will be a way through. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect or that it's going to be what you want or how you think it should be, but just kind of trusting that beyond whatever's going on at the moment, things can improve, and they do improve. I think that is it's a lost conversation that we don't talk enough about. And
I think it's incredibly courageous to have hope, faith, gratitude at a time where those things might be considered a bit Pollyanna-ish, but actually they are incredibly powerful emotions. And if you can tap into them, that's very brave and it shows great capability.
the science tells us as well is that even the decision, okay, well, I'm not willing to stay in this situation, and I'm not willing to get stuck in the lens of negativity and awfulness and catastrophizing. I'm willing to step out into something new, and that's not an easy transition, but it's possible. So it's not about believing that it's all going to be magical, but actually what we know is that the brain chemistry changes. So inadvertently, regardless of the outcome, you end up feeling a bit better regardless, because the brain chemistry changes the minute you transition and make those decisions. And you don't need therapy for that. You don't need therapy for that. That can be a game changer as well, where you become open to the possibility, okay, like everyone else, I might have a period of struggle, or I might have difficult stuff to navigate through. It's not like a surrender, but it's like a willingness to work with life rather than work against it.
Yes, yeah. I love that. You're swimming with the waves instead of against them. And also, I think from my perspective with what I went through with my suicide attempt, that spark that I needed, that you were talking about self-creating, happened after the lowest of the low moment. There was no way out apart from up for me. So I had that kind of, okay, I suppose I better get on with life if this is what's going to happen. And then these tiny little moments when I chose compassion for myself, or chose to go, do you know what, I'm going to do a marathon in a month. I'm just going to do it. And like that, it was just that, I didn't know at the time, but that my chemistry, my mind changed. The spark that I needed was there. I do not want anybody else to go through what I went through to gather that spark. And that's what we're trying to talk about, is imposing, having that awareness, having that self-compassion to go, do you know, I might have drunk 3 bottles of wine last night, but today it stops. Today is a new day. And it starts by going to the coffee shop and talking to the person there and just getting out of the house. And it could be as small as any of those things, a small step, but those tiny little sparks, those little moments of compassion, those little moments of hope, those are really, really important to try and instigate those before you have to.
Yeah. And so I want to add something to that, because I mean, most people would never say to somebody else, what they say to themselves, when it comes to this kind of internal persecutory you're shit, you're not good enough, you're a failure, blah, blah, blah. You know, most people do have these internal, very, very persecutory monologues that go on. And I think, you know, there's a really simple thing too, is that if you notice that you've get into that self-attack or self-deprecation or self-judgment, you know, just, you know, literally interject in short circuit and just kind of say, would you say that to someone else? Like, would you go up to another human being and say, you're a waste of space, you're a failure, you're an idiot? You know, like most of us would think, actually, that would decimate, you know, you're going to decimate this person, you're going to annihilate them. So if you wouldn't do that to somebody else, why on earth would you think that it's okay to do that to yourself on a regular basis? Like, and as often you see this in therapy, like when you present that to someone, they're like, it's a really good point. No one's ever pushed back on that, because it's like, actually, it's a really fair point. Why would that be okay? And how would that help you feel better in any way, shape or form?
Yeah, it's not helpful.
So it's just like, and that's an immediate shift that like any of us can do today. I think, okay, well, even if today, if that stops, that's a pretty big step forward.
Huge.
That's a massive actionable change. If we could just get everyone to start being a little bit nicer to themselves in their minds, I think it would make a huge shift. I also want to ask you both what you think about this big well-being boom that we're experiencing at the moment, and whether or not, Matt, maybe you might have felt differently in terms of the tools that were available to you if this was all happening at that time.
I do worry about this wellness boom. I think there's a lot of snake oil salespeople out there.
You're right to
selling
be
stuff,
critical.
and I'm
yeah.
very critical of it. I think it's another way of manipulating, and this aggression against big pharma is completely avoiding the aggression that maybe should be put towards big wellness. It's
larger industry.
Is a larger
Wellness is worth
industry.
more. Yeah.
Trillions, and I think what would be helpful would be more regulation, more safeguards, and just highlighting the professionals within that world. But saying that, it's a lot better, the conversation, the awareness, the stigmas that we talked about so openly over the last 10, 11 years. When I first talked about my mental health, I was the only guy that really talked about it on national telly, and it was a brand new thing. Now there's so many people talking about it from all walks of life. The conversation is a lot better, which puts more pressure on the services, obviously. But yeah, I have my problems with the wellness world. I really, really do. But I am very grateful that there are resources out there and podcasts out there, and newspapers and magazines are taking this a bit more seriously now.
It's a really, I mean, it's an interesting one. I sometimes get, it doesn't happen all the time, but I can have moments where people will comment, and they might be a coach or whatever they're doing, or a fitness person who's kind of involved in the mental health arena. And I've had people like literally, you know, condemn what I've said or come in with a completely contrary. Now, I'm open to discussion. I don't claim to be right on anything, but I do claim to be right when it's clinical evidence and scientific research that is like, actually, no, this is pretty solid. We know this. And sometimes I'll see somebody and they've gone off and they've done a weekend course, and they will with absolute authority come in and tell me that I'm wrong, and think, okay, well, I've spent 30 years in physical and mental health. I have some idea about how this works and what I see help and what I see not help. I think there's a real hunger in the industry where people believe that they should have huge platforms and that their voice should be heard, and that their month training and whatever they're doing then makes them the expert. And I think what we've got is we've got a lot of expert voices. And I think that's quite dangerous, because I think if I want, you know, like if I had a heart attack, it doesn't make me an expert in cardiology. It just doesn't. And I think we've got a lot of really strong expert voices. I think it's just becoming, and a bit like what you're saying, Matt, I just kind of think it's not language that you've used, but I think there's a crudeness in the industry as well, and a lot of feigned altruism. And that I struggle with. That I really struggle with. And I know someone could condemn me and say, well, you use platforms and you write books and you do. And I do. But unapologetically I do, because I'm trying to do my job, but in a bigger arena to reach many people. But I think there is a lot of I mean, it's a multi-billion-pound industry. And I do think that if the work isn't about changing people's lives fundamentally, and I'm really strong about this, if the work isn't about offering help and changing someone's life or helping them move forward even a step, then it's not worth doing. And if it's driven by profit, and it's driven by, if it becomes a business model or whatever it's meant to be, then of course it's, how is that ever going to align well when it's about when it's about vulnerability and human struggle? So
This is why I do my job. This is very much, why we have a wellness editor at The Independent. It's about fighting that misinformation and making health and healing more accessible, which is why we're here having this conversation. So hopefully it's helping. I also, speaking of wellness, do want to end, as I always do, on your one wellness non-negotiable. I know it's hard to pick just one, but if there were one thing that helps you get through the day, what would it be?
It's really difficult because I think I'm at that stage where there's a few things, but if I'm out and about working away, I really try to not go on my phone before my morning coffee. And I find that helps me then get to a point where if I do have my coffee and it's cooling down, I'll do 5 minutes of breath work or a bit of journaling. And I can see night and day how my day pans out if I grab my phone straight away. And even me not doing that, I'm putting myself first, which I never used to do, so that's my non-negotiable.
That's good. That's good advice. I like that one.
I mean, I do have quite a few, just in terms of functioning and doing the work and trying to do the work well and creating gaps in the day and stuff. But I guess every event I do, I try to end by the key premise of this work, I think, which is about, learning to talk to yourself and treat yourself as someone who matters, and living by that, not in a wishy-washy, fluffy way, but actually, you talk to yourself, you treat yourself as someone who matters. And it's something every day I think if I have a mantra that I start my day with, it's just I remind myself that that's the core essence of the work that I'm trying to do. So I try and embody that in my everyday life, whatever's going on or whatever the challenges are. It's just that has to be a non-negotiable. So I guess it's about practicing what you preach.
If you enjoyed this episode with Matt and Owen, I know you'll love this conversation with Ailey Jolie and Maya Raichura about how to find a therapist and whether therapy is right for you.